Excellent. All right. Thanks, Owen. So that was a really great presentation. Sort of covers a lot of ground, particularly in an area that I'm interested in, which is AI. So we'll start off this Q&A panel now. We have, we could just make sure that everyone's cameras and mics are on.
Yep, I'm here.
Great. Excellent. So the first question, just in the Zoom chat box, is for Prof. Chung and Michelle Dowsey. So basically, Emily Bell has said that a lot of great things are covered in that presentation, but they started off their PhD without knowing about any of them and were just lucky enough to stumble into a great team. How can somebody who is looking to start a PhD, or really research of any kind, I would say, for an extended period of time, sort of vet the team and the supervisors that they might want to engage with to make sure that they actually have a good experience and are well supported?
Do you want to start that? Okay, so I think, finding a supervisor should really be no different than finding a house to buy or a car to buy. What you're trying to look for is the quality of the product. And I think that comes from doing research. And that's what I meant earlier by due diligence. Don't get seduced by the charisma of the person talking to you on the screen. Actually ask around. And the point I was trying to make in the talk was ask the people who work with the supervisor. Check on the supervisor's productivity on PubMed. Have a look at the environment. If the supervisor's so great, how come they've got a tiny little shoebox and nothing else? Is it true that they have the capacity to provide what's needed? So it really does boil down to due diligence and asking people right there and then who are doing work with that supervisor.
Just to add to that, I'd say that in my experience anyway, people come to me to talk about embarking on a PhD, and I think I'm no different than many supervisors. We're always happy to talk to people about what a PhD looks like and how do you make some of these decisions, and happy for people to talk to us about that, even if we're not the people being considered for the supervisory role. So supervisors do have a wealth of experience and are always happy to provide some guidance, whether it's guidance to undertake a PhD within the team or outside. I know that I've done that. I know Peter's spoken to many person who's thinking about this. So that's another way to approach it as well, is to talk to people with good supervisory experience.
Also, for example, the head of an academic department has a view of all the different people and how they practice both in their own department and other departments. And I think students who are interested should go to someone with experience and say, look, I'm really interested here. I was thinking of this person. And I have, as I'm sure other supervisors or senior people have said before, well, that's great. That's a great idea. This is probably what you need. But, your suggestion of that supervisor, let's have a look at them. Well, I'm not sure. They have never supervised before. They don't have a higher degree. Let's have a look at their publications. They got 3. Well, if you're doing a whole PhD and spending the next 3.5 years of your life doing this, is this the product you want to invest in? And so there's a very practical situation that arises, and it just needs for people to have very clear thinking. That's why I say, you don't want to get seduced by a charismatic supervisor. I'm not sure if Erwin in his Erwin's had a lot of experience with this.
Sure, I'm happy to chip in actually. So I would say that when contemplating a PhD, the most important component is the topic. It has to be something that you really want to chase because you're going to be living and breathing it. But then the second most important decision is the supervisor. I think the supervisor is key to your success because the wrong supervisor will lead you down the wrong path. And, so I think the discussion here is very, very important. From my own experience, when I started my PhD, it was in a completely different topic with a completely different supervisor. But after 1 year, I realized that, again, that the topic that I picked wasn't what I was passionate about. So you have to have some passion and some love for it because, it's going to be something that you're really going to drill down and really investigate. But then changing the topic and then finding the right supervisor was great. So you really need to have someone who has the time, the experience, the track record, it's successful doctoral completions, someone who's done it. And then someone who has the time as well, right? Because you can pick the best person, but if they're busy, they're slow in response, you send them your thesis and it takes them 2 weeks to come back to you. That's not good enough. You want someone who can, especially right at the end, me and my supervisor, we were working 24 hours, I sent something back to him, he'll send me something back in an hour when we were trying to finish it out. That's someone that you want, someone who you can partner with and you can have a relationship with. So yeah, it's a good discussion. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So Emily, hopefully that answers your question. Is there anything else as well? So, yeah, so just Emily just has a follow-up question to that. So how can we get the message across that people looking to do research should be doing their due diligence? But given that, again, Emily didn't know until after they'd started. So I think, we have people right now who are jumping into PhD programs and so on because of these sort of allure and the people and Prof, I think, as you say, the charisma. It's sort of, it's an exciting thing and people are keen to do it and might not think about the pragmatic aspects. And I know that, if you're not really interested in the topic and you're not well supervised, it can be a real drag and it might just fail, which is the worst outcome. So how can we sort of disseminate that message to people, make sure it gets out there?
So I think from my perspective, one of the things that universities and institutions don't do well is tell people what they do. It's really interesting that we will say, we've got a Nobel laureate or two and we've done this fantastic stuff, but we don't actually say, and this is the door that you can enter. And these are the people who will hold your hands. And here are all the webcasts about it. And if you're interested, we want to talk to you. So, the promoting of that paradigm of we want to take you down this path is not well highlighted, I think. And as a faculty, we've really started to understand that a lot more. And I think the 21st century is a wonderful era where we can use social media now to really do the sort of stuff that previously we used to photocopy these flyers and stick them up on doors, but now we've got the cyber flyer, you know what I mean? And it's out there, we can pay attention. And this is about what I was saying earlier about getting with it. If that's the medium in which people are communicating, then that's the medium people like me should be using. I cannot be expecting people to use my medium from 30 years ago. It's actually up to me if I want to communicate with today's people, then I use today's medium. And I think, there's a lot that universities can do. We are usually old, traditional, rusted to the hull and need to be scraped hard before we show a shiny surface, but we can do it. And we've got really smart young people out there pushing us.
Agree. I really resonate with Erwin's point about being passionate about the research question as well. It is really critical, and your supervisor needs to be passionate about that question also. The other thing that we tend to do in our department is encourage people who are thinking about embarking on a PhD to actually make contact with our current PhD students, just for some one-on-one chats around how they're, what are they experiencing a PhD is like. And so I think that's another avenue as well and an angle to come from that might be helpful.
Owen, anything to add to that? Or?
Not really. I think it's been covered. I think PhDs, they're really, in general, if you look at them, the two types of PhD that attracts two types of people. The prepackaged PhD in some departments, some medical specialty departments have this track for trainees. You come and be a registrar with us, you go down this PhD track and they've got pet topics that they want people to do. And so it's all prepackaged for you. And people do that because they think, I want to do a PhD because I want to become a specialist in this area, work in public hospitals because that's the only way I can get a job. And so they're not really passionate about the topic. They do it, and That's one type. And then there's the other type where you de novo, you love this topic, you're interested, you may have an aspiration to be an academic or to be a clinician scientist. And you create the package, you find the right supervisor, the right topic. And so, I mean, I'm obviously generalizing. There's obviously a lot of overlap between the two, but I think do something that you really love and enjoy. I would advise people not to kind of, think that they're forced to do something when they don't want to. I want to be a dermatologist, I need to do a PhD, for example. But if you're going to do it, find something that really excites you, so that you can make a meaningful change to the world. You're adding to the literature.
I also think, Daniel, on that note, that people shouldn't think of PhDs as a product that they can just add to their CV or their attributes, but to use the PhD as an entree into what life has to offer. And I'll give you an example. I co-supervised an engineering student who was really interested in how people train themselves after amputation if you were to give them a neuroprosthesis. What's involved when they want to reach out and pick up a cup? Do they train the robot to move the elbow to extend, or do they move the shoulder that pushes the robot arm? So there are all these questions. And in the process of his PhD, we came up with a model and then a limb, and he got so excited and he was really wanted to know this. He's now leading the spin out that came from it. And so, although he was in the fundamentals of science and neuroprosthetics and robotics, he wanted to make an impact different. And so his degree now gave him an opportunity to lead a startup and industry and perhaps change the lives of people in a different sort of way. And I would really like to think the modern 21st century PhD gives all of us the opportunity to be different. So for example, Erwin does a PhD. He said he wasn't so interested maybe in that topic, but look, he's done law. He is into AI. And how we need clinicians and non-clinicians to bring that skill set into those areas that are becoming important in life, not just to be a researcher, not just to be a doctor. I would like that the next person who gives a medical legal opinion at the regulatory agency is a doctor who actually understands what it means. So they bring that knowledge to inform the process. And I think good PhDs and good postdoctoral positions open these sorts of doors to a much more comprehensive view of society and the supply chain, I guess you call it.
Great. Do you have a question?
No, that was answered.
Okay, no worries. So we have a question from Sid, sitting in the other room. So for Erwin, given you're interested in futurism and the example that you gave, how would you approach the trolley problem in a medical context?
Thanks, Sid. It's a good question. And the trolley problem in clinical practice expresses itself in different ways. So the best example I can give you is last year it's 2 years ago now, when Victoria introduced the voluntary assisted dying, or VAD legislation. We had to think about this in the context of what happens if different people want to access it. And then we really had to face this when COVID-19 came into play, when so in Australia, we were lucky because we really, even though Victoria saw a second wave, we really didn't see our ICUs get overwhelmed. And in fact, it was really our aged care facilities that were in trouble. But overseas in the US, in Italy, and other countries, the ICUs were overwhelmed. And so in Italy, for example, they had a thing called negative triaging, which is a concept, some of you might have heard about it. Ethicists hate it, where negative triage means if you are over 65, you do not get an ICU bed, right? So you have to be under 65. Now, in Australia, especially at St. Vincent's Health, Australia, we had to think about our policy and what guidelines we were going to give our clinicians. if we were running out of space in ICU, who do we give our beds to? Do we just use clinical prognostic factors, which is the utilitarian approach of ethics, the greater good? So if you're young and healthy, you got a long life, or you're going to be a productive member of society, you will get an ICU bed. But if you're homeless, a bit older, you've got diabetes, you're a smoker, you're not going to get the bed. Is that ethical? Is that right? So it's not exactly a trolley problem, but it is an ethical problem. I mean, it's kind of is. And so the decision was made that we will approach it from a point of view of not utilitarian, but from a point of view of justice. And what would we do in normal circumstances? Would we prefer the poor and the vulnerable? So it's an interesting concept for St. Vincent's, because our mission is to the poor and vulnerable, not to the advantaged and the rich. But and the bottom line is there is no single rule here. It has to be case by case. It has to be people have to think about it. They have to think about justice. Just because someone's homeless, or if someone's from a Aboriginal. So a good example is the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander population. They're automatically going to be disadvantaged because they're going to have issues to do with obesity, chronic disease, diabetes. So they're going to have less access to ICU just based on their prognostic factors. Is that right? Should we discriminate against that population? So it is something that as clinicians, we need to think about. It's not just a straightforward, the greater good, we're going to say 5 instead of the 1. Automatically, it is a complex decision-making process. I'm not sure if I answered your question, Sid, but I'm just trying to draw out the complexities around the ethics around this.
I think it's hard to neatly wrap up an answer to that question in a few sentences, so I think you did well. Michelle or Prof, anything to add on that one? Or?
I'll take a one.
I think like everything else, it depends on context. And I think what the pandemic did was it helped define the context of a major event and a disaster. And the world actually already has rules around how you manage these things. So for example, if you had a 3-car pileup, they will send 6, 10 ambulances to deal with the issue. And the resources would be that the person on the ground would immediately assess the scene. They would send the appropriate teams to each of the different injured people. In a disaster, what it's saying is the resources supplied are impossible to address every single person. And that's where in disasters, they assess who is most likely to survive, and they are the ones that are treated first. Okay, so the pandemic, although people weren't dropping like flies, it was our first experience at a global disaster where people could have died. The only reason why they didn't is because we had such wonderful 21st century medicine. But imagine if we had not responded in a certain way in preparation or whatever, how many people could have died? And I can foresee, as they had done in Italy, for example, people would come in with 2 and 3 bone injuries after motorbike accidents, and in other days they'd be rushed into surgery and they would spend the next 12 hours, 15 hours, 20 hours being repaired and put together and all the rest of it. Well, they didn't. They didn't, because the resources simply could not allow them to expend that. Because at the front door, they had people streaming in who were going to survive if you spent those resources on them. And so, it's a declaration of context, I think, that's really important. But behind that context needs to sit a governance body that knows when to call it a disaster or not, and therefore when to invoke that way of approaching it. But, this is where rules, ethics, humans, it's really, really important what society expects and understands. And this is where the wise heads become really, really important, and really experience counts in people who've been down certain journeys. But the trolley question, when you first look at it, you think, oh my God, but it depends. It depends, what the context is as to which way you pull that lever.
Do we prepare well enough for this do you think that we prepare well enough for these kinds of decisions? Or is our society somewhat complacent around these issues because we haven't had to face making those types of decisions so much?
Yeah, well, the question is, are we complacent? And I think in many respects, Australia is surrounded by oceans. We're not affected by our neighbours. We have a Universal Health Act. We have federated states, but we all have a single currency. We all train under a single college. So in many respects, we are very insular. And because we don't have disasters and we have had no theatres of war within Australia, we actually haven't prepared other than for bushfires, disasters. So, what I would like to know is how has COVID taught us, and why is it that 12 months down the track, we seem to be getting to the point where we're just starting to learn a lesson that was being taught 12 months before. And that raises the issues, right, of the approach of taking information in. We should be learning now from the first of a gentle opening of a wave to a sudden opening of a wave to a stuttering performance of a wave. And for each of those, the really smart people should be saying, right, we should invoke these things. That's just an example. That by no means is how it should be done. But what I'm trying to say is we should start getting contextual, and therefore we can maybe apply resources for each of those occasions or prepare those resources, because it's better than not preparing. I mean, hoping is not a strategy. You can't hope to do well in this. It's not a strategy.
So the next question comes from Nigel. So a question for Peter regarding the startup example that you gave. So during a PhD, do you have recommendations for balancing your core research work and pursuing potential impact for incentives or startups?
Yeah, so that's a really, really interesting question, because 95% of people who do PhDs just do a PhD. Because 95% of supervisors just think about it as a product that has a start and an end to it. What you want is an environment that says, what can we do with this information? And if you go to Berlin, for example, all the major technical universities there are focused on what are you going to do with this? And we're going to align it with industry right from the word go. So the product of your PhD is going to be realized. And so it takes a mindset. Now, that mindset may come from the student or it may come from the supervisor, but whenever it comes, grab it, because then you truly are force-feeding impact, and I think there is an invention in every single one of us. Every single one of us has an invention, and what we need to do is just run with it. It could be a tiny little thing. My anaesthetist had this great idea, because one patient who was very sick got from theatre to recovery room without the oxygen on. The mask was on, the tube was there, the tank was there, but someone forgot to turn the tap on. And he goes, oh my God, imagine if it actually counted, right? And then he did a survey and he found out how many times that actually happened. He was appalled. So he says, I'm going to design something that when you turn the oxygen on, this red light comes on straight away, or this red flag goes up. So you know straight away that there's oxygen flowing. And if the red flag doesn't come up, and he chose red because that's the color that you see that's very different from green or blue. It just pops itself up. And that really simple device is going to save lives. It is going to save lives. But we need to ensure the institution in which that practice is being introduced is aware of that and really keyed into what the purpose of the institution is. In a hospital environment, it's an absolute no-brainer. And yet, there will be people say, well, it costs an extra $1, so maybe we shouldn't do it. It's going to cost us money. And if you're not the patient on the trolley or the nurses receiving a patient without oxygen, or an anaesthetist transporting a surgeon not realizing there's no flow, unless you're one of those three people, you'll never get it. And so, you know, there needs to be a real driver in each of the teams, whether they're research teams, hospitals where there's research is being conducted, who really understand that there is an outcome, an impact to research that we always need to embrace and drive and inspire. Hope that answers the question. As usual, pretty long-winded response, but I hope it kind of gets it across.
Right. So Sid's got another question for Erwin. So the rate at which computers are evolving is significantly faster than regulations. In what ways would regulations, safeguards, and processes need to change to ensure we keep up with the latest and greatest computers? And I've got kind of an addition to that question, which is, do you think the brakes should be put on technological development and research sometimes before, while figuring out the ethical implications? Because I think that technology will always outstrip ethical and regulation considerations. So I think sometimes the only way is to actually put the brakes on or slow things down. But I also just think that no one's really going to be interested in doing that because people will just, because of the money incentives and so on, they'll always just keep developing.
Thanks, Sid, and thanks, Daniel, for the questions. So the first principle is that regulations, laws that human beings and society makes is a reflection of the norms that the culture that the population exists in, agrees to formulate, to govern interactions between the members of that society. So, you know, this is why you have slightly different laws based on the different cultures and backgrounds of different countries. But it kind of emerges out of the people within the society who then agree with one another, this is how we want to govern ourselves, so that there is some civility, there is some peace and structure around how we live. And by that very nature, if something's evolving really quickly and changing society, then the laws will have to catch up, because human beings are still trying to figure out. Social media is one good example. Social media kind of changed the way we look at privacy, we look at bullying and harassment, cyber stalking, all of those things. The law caught up. Cryptocurrency is another one, right? So Bitcoin, the law is still trying to catch up with Bitcoin. I mean, it's only been a few years ago that the ATO decided to tax it. And so computer technologies is no different. Having said that, there are some laws that are in place that are general enough to cover certain things. Like privacy laws will, even though it hasn't contemplated, social media will work. So, do we then, as you say, Dan, try to slow things down so that the law and society can catch up? The answer is that governments attempt to do this. They put in brakes around cryptocurrency. They put in brakes around new technologies. The TGA puts in rules. Just last year or the year before last, they said software is now a medical device, to put in some, brakes and governance around it. But the truth is, as you say, it's not just money. It's also the fact that when something's invented, people are going to just push it to the limit. Like nuclear power. Right now, besides AI, the other area where in medicine that's revolutionizing how we're treating people is genetic engineering and gene editing. CRISPR, that's just flying, and it's only now that laws are catching up. If you go back 2-3 years ago, China was leading the race because they had no rules around CRISPR. They were doing germ cell embryonic editing and letting babies be born. I mean, there was a scientist who went to jail. He had twins kind of grow up after he edited the genome. And so one could argue that you can't put brakes on it, but you want to regulate it and to ensure that it doesn't get out of hand. There will always be countries around the world that ignore that and push it. So AI is a good example. There are some countries out there pushing the boundaries of AI. And it's an arms race now in the space of AI, in the space of genetic engineering, in the space of the space race that's happening. So I would think that there has to be some governance, but I'm not sure that you can stop it. There will be lots of government research around this. DARPA in the US. A lot of military defense people are playing around in all this space, even if they want to stop civilians from doing it. So it's going to keep going, and we'll just see where we end up.
So this question's for everyone. So research takes time, and by the time you start a project to when you finish it, it could be a matter of years. It's a major project. How do you ensure that a project is worthwhile before you start, knowing that things change over time and it may seem cutting edge now, but then it might lag behind in a few years? So how do you kind of project forward when you're developing projects to make sure it will sort of still be impactful when you finish?
I have to think about that for a minute.
So I think, there is one truism, and that is where you start your PhD and where you end it is often at a different point. It's never the same. And the start of the PhD has an idea, but there's sometimes an aha moment within it that leads to something else. And I often say, it's a general direction you're looking to go, plus 60 degrees either side. And as you get closer to your mark, your focus narrows until right before you present your thesis, you're on the money. So that shift of focus comes from the nudges that you get through your experiments, through the things that you hear people say. And if you keep up with the literature, your research, you will see what's coming down the pike, and you will be aware of what the changes are. And it really is a living thing. PhD research is a living thing. You are the most up-to-date person in that field when you're doing your PhD, because theoretically you're reading all the articles on it, and you have come up with an innovative idea that you will pursue, and your reading tells you that people haven't actually thought about it as yet. So wouldn't be worried about change, wouldn't be worried that things should change. In fact, change is a wonderful thing. It just means you now have better focus. You're actually seeing things around you that you weren't aware of at the start.
On a very practical note, I think the first at least 6 months of a PhD, as Peter said, you have a topic in mind, and it can be somewhat broad, and you do spend a lot of time. Our students do spend a lot of time on their narrative and systematic reviews, and that really does help to reveal what the gaps are out there, and there's more often than not more than one gap. So that helps set you up. So that first year is really about understanding absolutely everything about your topic and becoming the person that knows the most about what does and doesn't exist in the area. And then together with your supervisors, you're working out that plan for the subsequent 2 years about exactly what the focus of the PhD is going to be like. So that's, I guess, how I approach it.
Erwin, do you have any?
Yeah. I'll make a couple of comments. So it's a good question, Daniel. And I think on top of what Michelle and Peter have already said, as you narrow down your topic in your research question, you need to make sure that even though your view might be ambitious and broad, your research project has to be concise and circumscribed enough for you to complete. Because one of the mistakes that people do is to be too big. And to come, this is why your supervisor and the team is going to be very important in advising you to come up with a research project that's small enough that can be completed on time, but novel enough and original enough that it is new research. It is adding to the literature and to the evidence base. And that balance is important. So, you can't be too ambitious and do a project that's too big. It has to be, you have to be able to complete it. And to your point about then, how do you then make sure that it impacts? I think, it's already been discussed. You also want to make sure that whatever research question you have is translational in the sense that, it's not an esoteric question. Although to be frank, I have no problems with people who have esoteric questions and do research on a topic that actually has no practical use because it's a question. Human beings want to answer questions, and I think that's okay. But for doctors, for clinician academics who want to have an impact, yeah, you want to think of a translational question that actually, so you work with clinicians in the front line to try to answer one of their questions and solve a problem. So then you do have real world impact and it's not just an esoteric question for yourself, but that's not invalid. And usually even esoteric questions sometimes does have unintended real world impacts. Someone finds a use for it.
Yeah. So the next one is for you, Owen. To what extent do you think AI can realistically make a difference in Australian healthcare in the near future, 5 to 10 years, given the system level and infrastructure developments that need to occur? And I would also say the sort of cultural shifts in understanding that need to occur with practitioners who will be using this technology. What do you think it will actually look like in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. It's a good question. At the moment, it's already making a difference. I think AI is being used, even whether we like it or not. And it's part of our computers, part of our phones. It's a lot of systems already have it embedded. And it depends on what you mean by AI. So AI is such a broad term, right? So in terms of algorithms to help you mine data, we do that. We do that quite well in a lot of health-related areas like finance, data analytics, and business development type things. And where we are still improving is in direct clinical care. That's a bit of a Wild West still, in the sense that when in the diagnostic area, it is maturing quite quickly. So pathology and radiology, the big vendors and the providers already use it. And now the new diagnostic imaging machines have AI modules already baked into it that will just give you decision support. And it will be very long when it will just become, it's already better than humans, and it will just become the gold standard. I think that's where in big pathology labs no longer use human beings to do pap smear screening, to do antibiotic sensitivities. Human beings are out, computers do it very well, they automate it and they do it fast and cheaper. And so then when it comes to then treatment decision-making, and then in the surgical space, when it comes to supporting surgeons when they do surgery, instead of just having surgeons control robotics, they become semi-autonomous and then autonomous. That is emerging. That is cutting edge. Peter would be the expert here. The big companies are definitely playing in this space, and it is, Da Vinci 2.0. The actual robots that can actually augment and potentially replace some of the more kind of administrative type surgical things like suturing and closing up wounds and things, that will probably come. I think it will come, and health networks have to catch up in terms of how we introduce these things safely and how we train medical graduates to interact with the systems well. It's going to be an interesting world because where we are falling behind is, especially as Vincent, to be honest, is we still lack the IT infrastructure, just the basics, the pipes. We don't have the right networking. We don't have an EMR. We don't have the cross linkages between the databases. So the basics are missing. Having said that, AI systems are clever enough to actually link things for us. And so we are kind of playing catch up. We at St. Vincent's, we've got an innovation hub right now, and we're working with a couple of AI vendors to introduce it across a group. So the different hospitals are all working together to see how we can use AI to help us predict things at the moment. And as we introduce an EMR, it will have AI baked in, and then it will be then training our doctors to figure out the advice to take and how to interpret the advice coming from those systems. And as I was saying, I think the key here is decision making. Is who makes the final decision. As long as human beings are still there, then we hold the key. But once we let that go, that's when things get interesting.
I think we have time just for one more question. So this is primarily aimed at Prof. Chung and Michelle, but everyone, I'm sure you can weigh in as well. So what do you think is the most important skill or quality or characteristic of the modern postdoc, and why? If you had to pick one from your list.
You've got to answer something first.
So can you just, what did you say? What is the one thing, a key attribute?
Yeah, key attribute basically of the modern postdoc.
It has to be curiosity. And really wanting to answer a question.
Do you agree, Prof. and Owen?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely top of the list, is a curiosity to know. To that, I would probably add a burning desire to find a solution.
Right.
Yeah, and I completely agree with Michelle and Peter. And I think you want to be someone who is able to balance being an expert in an area, because by that point, you've picked a niche topic that you want to be an expert in, and either locally, nationally, or internationally, you want to be able to speak with authority on that topic. And then, as Peter already pointed out, you also want to be someone who's a bit of a Renaissance person. You also want to be able to be interprofessional, multidisciplinary. You want to be able to cross boundaries. You don't want to be so expert that you're kind of stuck in a niche, but you also want to be able to talk to other people from other industries and bring them together. So it's you want to be someone in the postdoc world that's seen to be an expert, but also seen to be someone who can straddle different worlds and bring it together.
And I'd just say, just in general, not to dispute anything that Erwin said, but I actually think being ambitious in terms of what you would like to do is not such a bad thing when you're starting out. If you have ambitious and visionary questions to ask, we know that translation of research, taking something from bench to bedside, for example, takes 15 years. So it's okay to have a big, ambitious question, but just to understand that you'll make a contribution to that journey, but you're working with your supervisors to understand where your contribution begins and ends.
Great. Yep. Excellent. So thanks everyone. That brings us to our first break. I think that was a really great session. I think everyone learned a lot. I certainly did. And the question and answer time I think was really fantastic. Got a lot out of it. So for everybody tuning in, we've got a 30-minute break now. We'll be back at 11 o'clock. Make sure you jump back on a couple of minutes early for session